was a Christian, my entire life. I was born a Christian. And, as I got older, I started, I got into science, and then I started kind of questioning certain things about religion.
Okay.
And there's certain things like I still want to be a Christian, but I can't lie to myself and tell myself that I believe all the things in the Bible. And I'll give you one example. Okay, so if you picture creation where absolutely nothing existed, there's no laws of gravity, there's no laws of current flow, there's nothing at all, only God, and God creates everything, then you have to question, why did God create evil? Why did God create things to happen a certain way when God had all the power in the world to make it so evil wouldn't even be necessary? Some of right now, I can't jump up in the air and fly up to the moon. So God did put limitations in his creation. So why are other things that are incredibly evil, why are they not limited by God? And also another thing is, if you want to look at the free will argument, when everybody has a choice, but it's also a false choice if you're going to say, hey, you can do anything you want to do, but if you don't serve God, then you're going to go to eternal damnation, and you're going to be cast into the lake of fire for eternity. So it's not necessarily a actual choice. So you really don't have much freedom in how you live your life. And one last thing, and I'll let you rationalize some of this stuff. In terms of all of us being God's creations, God's children, why would you punish your children with eternal damnation when you know how flawed the human creation is, and the capacity for error in human judgment? So it's like, they wouldn't, knock a cup down or something, and then I punish them with burning in eternal fire and brimstone for the rest of eternity. It doesn't, it's hard to rationalize these things.
Okay, so can I ask you in response some questions? Because that's the way I'm going to argue, is to compare our positions and our worldview. So let me answer your statements. First thing I would say is that you said, why did God create evil? We don't think evil is a creation, so we don't think it has any positive existence. Evil is first and foremost a privation, or a what you could say is non-being. And secondly, I would say there's also a further clarification as to what evil means, which is an act of the will. So now it becomes a question of why does God permit evil by beings that have the ability to will evil or good? And I would say, well, although I don't know in totality why God would permit it, the Christian worldview gives me a basis to know how there is good and evil. And I would say that your worldview has no basis to critique Christianity, because you couldn't give an account for good or evil, or the true or the false, which would be necessary for doing a critique at all. So I'd be glad to hear, the non-theist as a non-Christian, how it is you can say that anything is true or false, or wrong or right, if atheism is the case.
Okay, yeah, that's an easy question. But first, I have to ask you about I have to comment on, whether or not God created evil. It's like I said earlier, you have to actually picture absolutely nothing in this world existing. Nothing in creation existed. God created everything. He created our ability to thought. He created our capacity of thought. He created every single law. He created absolutely everything. We can't create anything that God hasn't already created. So that's my point for the argument on whether or not God created evil.
Well, why is that the case? Why can't God create a world where beings have the ability as secondary causes to actually do things?
I would imagine that he would have to create what the different things that they could do. It would be like a video game. The video game characters can't do anything outside of the way that they.
Well, that's a false analogy, because it's a false equivalence between beings that have free will and beings that do not. So video game characters do not have free will, and the Christian worldview specifically teaches that God does create humans to have the power of free will. So in other words, you're saying that it can't happen is kind of, it sounds like it's based on prior assumptions, and I would just like to know, on what basis do you know that God can't create beings with free will?
Well, you have to establish free will first.
Right. Yeah.
There's no, if you have a computer program, or if you have a robot, the robot doesn't know that a program's running. The thinks that the robot, he thinks he has free will, but technically there's just a program running.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the argument. So do you want me to prove free will to you?
You can try. I mean, I've thought about it in almost every perspective, but I'd be interested. I think you're a very smart guy.
So my argument for free will is that if free will does not exist, then knowledge is not possible, because the fact that you are arguing presupposes the ability to choose the true or the false, the good or the bad. And so argumentation itself presupposes the reality of free volition, choice, free will.
I kind of disagree with that, because if you think about everything is a reaction to like cause and effect.
Okay. So are your arguments reactions to cause and effect?
Yes.
Okay.
I think everything is a reaction to, like, there was probably one initial movement.
Okay. So you're not actually making an argument. So
you're it could actually be a false belief that's totally wrong, but you're caused to believe and think that it's true.
So it's possible that everything you're saying is a chemically determined. Everything you're saying could potentially be a chemically determined false belief.
True.
Okay. Then you're not making an argument.
So at that point, given that presupposition that everything's determined and there is no free will, the very notion of truth and falsity is an incoherent concept.
And thus, there's no such thing as argumentation. So you can't argue.
And therefore, your position can't be true.
But who's to say that we can't have this type of discussion and it's just predetermined? It's written into the script.
The argument is that if that is the case, then knowledge and truth and falsehood, etc., would be impossible. So it's a self-defeating argument at this point. It's called the determinist fallacy or the naturalist fallacy.
But you can put two computer programs and let them argue back and forth, and I mean, without an issue. But
there's nothing true or false about it. That's the point.
The whole computer programming system is based off true and false.
No, it's not.
Binary ones and zeros.
You can't say that.
You can't get out of the matrix in the system to be able to say that, if you're assuming you're part of the matrix too, because you just be determined to say a false belief.
Yeah, I mean,
so that's what we're trying to point out, is the notion of you saying this conversation can be true or false, or we're having agreement or disagreement, is meaningless. It's all determined. There is no truth or false given your presupposition, and therefore it's self-refuting to actually say that determinism could possibly be true. Therefore, by impossibility of the contrary, free will must be the case, given that you're assuming all these things.
Right. And I think that we're both kind of like the same argument you're making toward me. It can also, be used toward you guys' argument as well. That
no, it can't. How am I caught in the naturalist fallacy if I don't accept the presupposition of determinism in a naturalistic sense?
Because you don't have to accept anything about physics for physics to still run its course. It does. Whether or not you accept it.
But I'm asking you metaphysics questions. So it's not about physics. So you're assuming that physics is the same thing as metaphysics. What we're talking about are metaphysical issues that go beyond physics. So as an atheist, you're trying to say, well, but physics is determined, it's just cause and effect. But we just gave an argument from metaphysics about free will that shows that if you adopt the determinist presuppositions and worldview, you can't know that it's true. So your argument assumes that naturalism and determinism are true. If naturalism and determinism are true, you can't know that it's true, is the point. And that's a defeater.
I can kind of see what you're saying, but it's still, in my opinion, there's just way too many things leading to, or at least leading me to believe that free will is not necessarily anything more than just, like a computer program running. It may be very complex at this point.
Let me put it another way. So your position is X and ours is not X. But given your position that it's all determined, we're determined to say X just as much as you are to say not X.
And there's no way to delineate between X and not X. So that's the defeater.
X and not X, one's not more valid or invalid than the other, which is another illustration that your position is self-refuting.
So, and your reply is
you're saying we're wrong and that my position's correct. But if your position's correct, then both are equally determined.
And no one is correct.
What they are. Right. And so they're both equally valid. So that means something that is both, that you would say is both true and false the same, or something can be both true and false in the same way, which is nonsensical.
I'm not saying that you guys are wrong or that I'm right. I'm just saying that it seems to me like the way, the way
so now you're trying to talk out of the argument. The argument was that determinism is true. So you did make that argument.
Well, I'm arguing for it, but I'm not saying that I'm absolutely right. I'm not, my mind isn't closed at this point. That's why, I'm talking to you guys
right.
and asking the question. But from my perspective, it looks more like everything's acting on cause and effect.
So like if the first argument fails because determinism is self-refuting via the naturalist fallacy, the determinist fallacy, then what are the things that you say makes it look like it?
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with you that it failed either, but I don't want to argue with you guys.
Explain
you guys
how.
Both kind of agree with it, so I'm just.
It's a really important argument.
You can say I don't agree, but
grasp what the argument is. Obviously,
right.
We can't move forward.
Right, but I'm just saying you can easily create a computer program that argues back and forth. I mean, so that, in my opinion, destroys your argument.
So, do you understand that that's not a reply, because it doesn't matter if you say that? That's just stating what you already think is the case. So, how does that answer the objection that we offer? The objection is that if it's the case that everything is determined, you could never know it. And you're replying by saying, but everything's determined.
Why could you never know it?
Because it's a defeater. It's a self-contradictory argument to say everything is determined, but I know it's true that everything is determined.
For example, your position would be determined. So you couldn't actually know if that were true, because you'd have to know if it weren't true as well.
So there's no way to know the true from the false. Do you understand that you've surrendered the possibility of debate and argumentation by arguing this? That's the point.
And like I said, another defeater is, if everything is determined, you could be determined to believe that false beliefs are actually true. In other words, you could be determined to be deceived. So according to determinism, how do you get out of that problem?
It's a box. How are you out of the box?
In either way, we would both be in the box.
I don't adopt determinism. I'm not arguing determinism.
Determinism puts you in a box, is what Jay is saying. We don't buy into determinism, so we're not in the box.
So you don't believe that
something that's false to be actually true.
Do you believe that God is all-knowing, that God knows everything, past, present, and future?
Yeah, but he can also, by divine power, create beings that have free will and are secondary causes. There's no reason, there's nothing about God's character that prevents him from creating that.
So if God knows everything, past, present, and future, then that's a form of determinism right there.
It's only a form of determinism if
categories. It's the way that we talk about time and the way that God relates to time.
I just said God can create beings that are secondary causes. It's only determinism if God is the sole cause. There's not one cause in the universe. God creates beings who are secondary causes.
Well, we have to kind of disagree on that. And I mean, I'm pretty sure there's people that agree with you guys, and I'm pretty sure there's people that agree with me on it. But let me add one more portion to that argument that may, further my case a little bit.
Okay.
So if you if you think all the way back to the beginning of creation, whenever God, started creation off, everything, I would imagine that everything was void. There was no movement. There was no time. There was nothing physical. So there had to be an initial first movement that every other action was a reaction to that first movement. If I set up a bunch of dominoes, and in order to get the dominoes rolling, I had to hit one domino, and then every single domino, miles and miles down the road for years and years and years.
Yeah, I mean,
they're all still a result of that one
so
movement.
I can speak on this. Part of the problem is that the modern mind can't really understand this, because moderns have limited themselves to only one type of causality. So the type of causality that you're talking about is like what Jay said, that there's only one, that you're conceiving only one kind of proximate and efficient causality. But prior to modernity, the ancients had at least 4 different types of causality. And as Jay said, furthermore, primary and secondary causality. So the mistake that you're making is saying there can only be this one type of causality because that's the only type of causality that I can conceive. And that's this kind of domino, efficient, deterministic causality. But I can just point to the history of philosophy. The majority of philosophers have never adopted that that's the only form of causality that there is.
You guys got some pretty good points and pretty good perspectives. I appreciate y'all giving me the opportunity to speak. I don't want to hog the time up in here, so
appreciate that.
Thank you, guys.
Yep, good questions. Last thing I would say is that the notion of a causal chain like dominoes is kind of the mechanistic, deistic idea of causation that comes from the Enlightenment. And like Father Deacon said, that's just one type of causation. So typically physicalist views of the universe rely on just that type of causation, as if that's all it means is just a domino and thus the chemically determined causal chain. But there's different types of causes or different types of agents. And so the arguments that you made, although you may not have been intended on going into metaphysics, they actually relied on a host of metaphysical things that I was trying to critique.